This is part two of post-revolutionary Mexico and Cardenista populism. And just at the end of part one, I was talking about the changes to the party structure and how he tried to incorporate people. Well, that's really not the big thing he did. The most important things he did had to do with his program in practice. And one of the things he's most remembered for is his agrarian reform. In the first 3 years, remember it's a 6-year presidency, 1934 to 1940. In the first 3 years of his presidency, he distributed the most land ever distributed in Mexico. More than 44 million acres went to 800,000 Mexicans. And the statistic there, and these are good statistics because they're really illustrative of how significant his agrarian reform was, is he distributed two-thirds of all of the agrarian reform between 1910 and 1940. So this was taking land from big estates, often that wasn't being used, and redistributing it to former peasants who had become dependent workers. Now, he did this, it wasn't just a seizure, he did it in a very creative way. He blended capitalism with collective forms of agriculture. And this term collective forms of agriculture is important because, it's in the 20s and 30s that the Soviet Union is collectivizing agriculture, creating state farms. It's really quite bleak. This is not that. What the state did was it used its power to reconstruct the old colonial and early 19th century vision of the ejidos, of the peasant villages. But they did so with tremendous state support. The government, for really the first time, provided inexpensive credit, right? Because a lot of farmers, are in debt, or don't have any revenue until they can sell their crop. So they have to take out loans and then they can repay them, after the harvest. And he made that very inexpensive with subsidized credit. They also subsidized seeds and fertilizer and had extension services, right? So the government would come out and help you understand where to plant and what to plant and how to market your products, and sometimes to make cooperatives. So if you go to the store and you see Land O'Lakes butter, that's not a corporation, that's a cooperative of dairy farmers. Same with Sunmaid, that's a cooperative of citrus producers and grape producers. Well, that's what they did in Mexico, and all of the profit from this would be held by these peasants. They would make the money, but now with tremendous assistance from the state. Now, this was incredibly popular throughout Mexico. It's estimated that about a quarter of all of Mexico benefited directly or indirectly from these policies, that this was much more kind of domestic form of agriculture. So there was cheaper food sold throughout the nation. It wasn't just all for export, that agricultural areas blossomed as more and more people had more and more money in their pocket because it's more profitable. And parts of what we call the Bajío, which is the Central Valley of Mexico, there almost 50% of the population was benefiting. And if you think back to the lecture on the revolution, this is the area from which Zapata came. This is where you had an angry peasantry that had lost its land. Well, under Cardenas, they get that back. He also created a state institution that was going to be big political support for the state because it was the National Confederation of Peasants, the Confederación Nacional Campesina, and it was bringing these now happy, rewarded peasants into the state system. It is important to understand that there's a very sophisticated combining of modern and traditional forms. The state, which is very modern, promoted traditional agriculture. The state also promoted the notion of a male-centered household. This was not liberating women and giving women their own farms and that sort of thing. It was reconstituting the colonial era and early 19th century way of doing things. And also, and I don't know if this was on purpose or inadvertently, it made these ejidos, these new peasant communities, reconstituted peasant communities, highly dependent on the state. If it weren't for the inexpensive credit, the inexpensive seeds and fertilizer, the extension services, a lot of these ejidos would have failed, and they succeed because the government is there to help them. So it's a real interesting melding of the traditional and the modern. But Cardenas is equally recognized for the work he did in the industrial sector. Labor had done well in the 20s under the CROM, which is the umbrella group of unions, because it was so tied to the state. But Cardenas went even further and put the state in the middle of industrial relations using this corporatist system. And this happens elsewhere in Latin America as well. The idea is that rather than having strikes, he wanted disputes settled by negotiations. And the state would have one representative of the state, one representative of workers, and one representative of employers, and they would hash out what was going on in a particular industrial dispute. But if you think about that, that puts all of the power in the state's hands, because the workers always want a raise and the employers never want to give it, or they want to give a small one, and the state has a deciding vote. So he really puts the state in the middle of things. And the state is intervening tremendously in strikes. In a railroad strike in the late 1930s, Cardenas decided that he had had enough, and he simply nationalized the railroad. He took it over, and he gave that to the state. And then later in that year, in March 1938, a series of strikes against foreign oil companies led him to create Petróleos Mexicana, or Pemex, which still exists. The national oil company is created in 1938. Now, in the case of the railroads and oil, it was a lot of U.S. businesses. And, there were some European, but it was a lot of U.S. businesses. And a question always comes up, why didn't the United States protest this? Well, there are two main reasons, one more than the other. The first is that the one that's not as important is that the railroad interests and the oil interests were bitter enemies of Franklin Roosevelt back in the United States. And so he wasn't that interested in helping them out. But more importantly, the good neighbor policy of the 1930s was an official policy of the United States to kind of let Latin America be and to just have good relations. And with the coming of World War II, and in 1938, Franklin Roosevelt knew World War II was coming, his main interest was to keep the oil flowing, to keep the railroads moving so that, commodities from Mexico could come to the United States. And he really didn't care who controlled it as long as they worked. And so that was very lucky on Cardenas's part that the United States was not terribly interested in opposing that. So between the agrarian reform and Pemex, Cardenas is wildly popular. But he also had a very extensive public education system. He emphasized the study of history and science and rational thought. And you can see here that it's a real worry about kind of superstitious, overly religious peasants that he saw in the Cristero Rebellion. And he is very much a modernizer. He wants to create a modern sense of Mexico, a collective national identity that fights against what he sees as the superstition of regionalism and religion. And it's important to remember he is very much part of that revolutionary group from the 1910s and 1920s that does not like the church, that takes its view of that all the way back to the 19th century liberals and La Reforma, that's incredibly anti-clerical. But as successful as he was, there were problems. One was that when strikers or workers are striking and they hate their boss, and you come in and you say, okay, we've taken over the industry. You no longer have these foreign bosses. The government now owns it. Well, now, if workers don't get what they want, they're not mad at an American boss or an English boss or even a rich Mexican boss. They're mad at the state. They're mad at you. Also, the nationalized enterprises were often weak. The railroads were decapitalized. These foreign companies didn't have the most modern trains and track and all that, and same with the oil companies. But workers' expectations were incredibly high. They really thought that, that this was the perfect endpoint. But there are real additional limits to this as well, is that he's consolidating things, but, he's starting to worry that maybe he's gone a little bit too far to the left. In fact, Mexico is seen as so progressive and so left-wing, and I think it's a little bit of a misreading of it, that refugees from the Spanish Civil War flock there. Leon Trotsky, the great Soviet revolutionary who has a big falling out with Stalin, flees to Mexico. And he actually was having an affair with the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, and he was murdered in her house by agents of the Soviet Union. So it's a place where just a lot of leftists are going. And Cardenas starts to worry because I think he's a very sincere Democrat who cares very, very deeply about Mexico as a nation, that maybe he's gone too far to the left. And what he did, just as he had been picked by someone to be the next president, is he decided that the best thing for Mexico would be to pick someone who was much more conservative than he to be the next president. And so he chose a very Catholic, very conservative politician named Avila Camacho, who was, it says there from left to right. In other words, that Cardenas is not in that picture, that Cardenas was on the left, and he decided to put someone in on the right. And it was actually a very good idea to put a conservative in when Mexico was going to be working closely with the United States during World War II, which had already started in Europe. So what can we say about Cardenas? As I said at the beginning, he's the most popular leader in the history of Mexico. He chose Camacho to keep politics from becoming too radicalized, too polarized. He didn't want things to continue a leftward push. He wanted a kind of pendulum swing. And you can see in that, or at least I choose to read in that, a deep belief in democracy, at least the democracy that post-revolutionary Mexico was going to have, which is a one-party democracy. But his decision to move back to the center and maybe even the right was to keep things from being too polarized, because I think his fear was if it kept going, then there would be such a backlash that they could face something like the Cristero Rebellion, or even worse, another revolution. But he did do a lot. And I think that he's a sincere Democrat, as Madero was, but he's one who accomplishes things that Madero never would have been able to accomplish. His agrarian reform, his support for labor, his creation of the national oil industry are all things that have long-term impact and really help transform Mexico and really fulfill the promises of the revolution, at least through 1940. What happens after 1940 gets very complicated and convoluted, but it really does deepen the 1917 Constitution and its various goals. And I think it's why he is considered one of the most popular presidents or leaders in Mexican history. And it also helps us understand how populism worked, at least in this one country.